The year was 1873, and the mountains of West Virginia still held more secrets than roads. There were places where maps ended, where the land itself seemed to reject the idea of being known. Black Hollow was one of those places. Most people didn't even agree on where exactly it was. If you asked in the town of Redmarsh, a fading settlement tucked between two ridges of pine and stone, you'd get different answers depending on who you spoke to. Some would gesture vaguely north toward a stretch of forest where the sunlight barely touched the ground. Others would simply shake their heads and tell you not to go looking for it, but everyone agreed on one thing. People who passed too close to Black Hollow had a habit of never coming back. At first, it didn't seem unusual. The mountains were dangerous, trails vanished under landslides, rivers swelled without warning. Bears and wolves still roamed freely. If a man disappeared out there, it was easier to assume nature had claimed him than to ask harder questions, and for years that's exactly what people did. They assumed. Until the summer of 1873, when the disappearances began to follow a pattern that even the most stubborn minds couldn't ignore. It started with a trader named William Carter. He was a careful man known for keeping detailed notes of his routes and deliveries. When he failed to arrive in Redmarsh with a shipment of tools and fabrics, the delay raised concern, but not alarm. Delays happened. But then his wagon was found. It sat abandoned on a narrow trail about 3 miles north of town. The horses were gone, the cargo missing, but there were no signs of struggle. No blood, no broken wheels. Just a quiet, unnatural stillness, as if the wagon had been placed there deliberately. William Carter was never seen again. 2 months later, a young couple traveling west passed through Redmarsh. They stayed one night at the local boarding house, spoke with several townsfolk, and left at dawn, heading toward the northern pass. They never reached the next town. Search parties went out, combing the trails and riverbanks. They found nothing, no belongings, no tracks, no bodies. It was as if the mountains had swallowed them whole. That was when people began to whisper about Black Hollow again. The name had been around for decades, passed quietly between generations. It wasn't an official place, not marked on any map, but everyone knew the stories. A stretch of land deep in the forest where no one settled, where even hunters avoided lingering too long. And at the center of those stories was a family, the Black Hollows. No one could say exactly when they had arrived. Some claimed their ancestors had been there before the Civil War. Others insisted they had come from the east, fleeing something they never spoke of. What was certain was that they kept to themselves, always had. The head of the family was a man named Elias Black Hollow. Tall, gaunt, with a face that seemed carved from stone. People who had seen him in town described his eyes as unsettling, too still, too watchful, like he was studying something beyond what was visible. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was only to complete a transaction. He came into Redmarsh every few weeks, always alone, always at dusk. He bought flour, salt, kerosene, never more than necessary, never less. He paid in old coins, worn smooth with age, and then he left. No one followed him, not because they couldn't, because they chose not to. His wife, Margaret, was seen even less. On the rare occasions she appeared, she kept her face partially covered, her gaze fixed on the ground. There was something wrong about her presence, people said. Not something you could explain, but something you could feel. Like standing too close to the edge of a deep well. As for the rest of the family, they were shadows. People spoke of sons and daughters, of older relatives who never left the property, but no one had ever seen them clearly. It was as if the forest itself kept them hidden. For years, that had been enough, until the disappearances began to stack up. By midsummer, 4 people were missing, then 5, then 6. All of them had passed near the same region. All of them had vanished without a trace, and still no one acted. Fear has a way of convincing people to look away. In Redmarsh, it settled into daily life like dust. Conversations would begin to drift toward the subject, then abruptly change. People avoided the northern trails. Travelers were warned to take longer routes, even if it added days to their journey. But warnings only go so far. Because sooner or later, someone always ignores them. His name was Thomas Hale. He was a hunter, born and raised in the mountains, familiar with terrain most men wouldn't dare enter. If anyone could move through those forests safely, it was him. He had heard the stories, he didn't believe them. To Thomas, the disappearances had a logical explanation. Bandits, maybe. Or simply a series of unfortunate accidents being twisted into something more sinister by frightened minds. So when he tracked a wounded deer deep into the northern woods, he didn't hesitate. He followed the trail for hours, moving through thick undergrowth and uneven ground. The forest grew denser as he went, the trees taller, their branches knitting together to block out the sky. At some point, he realized something was wrong. The usual sounds of the forest had faded. No birds, no insects, no distant rustle of animals moving through the brush, just silence. He should have turned back then. Instead, he kept going. The deer's trail led him to a clearing, a small patch of open ground surrounded by towering trees. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, until he noticed the rocks. They had been stacked deliberately, forming a low, uneven mound near the center of the clearing. It wasn't something nature would have arranged, it was something made. Thomas crouched low, studying the ground. The soil looked disturbed, recently, and then he heard voices. They were faint, coming from somewhere beyond the trees. He moved quietly, stepping carefully to avoid making noise until he reached the edge of the clearing. What he saw made him freeze. 3 figures stood near the rock mound, 2 men and a woman. They wore dark, worn clothing, their movements slow and deliberate. One of the men held a shovel. The other had something wrapped in a heavy cloth, something long, something shaped like a body. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He strained to hear what they were saying. "Not here," one of them muttered. "Too close." "Then where?" another voice replied, low and irritated. A pause. "Back to the house." The woman shifted, adjusting her grip on the covered shape. For a moment the cloth slipped slightly, just enough to reveal a hand. Pale, limp, human. Thomas didn't wait. He backed away slowly, then turned and moved as fast as he could without crashing through the underbrush. Once he was far enough, he ran. He didn't stop running until the trees began to thin and the familiar edges of red marsh came into view. By the time he reached town, his lungs burned and his legs trembled. He went straight to the sheriff. Sheriff Daniel Mercer was not a man easily shaken. He had seen his share of trouble, brawls, theft, the occasional violent dispute, but nothing like what Thomas described. At first he listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Thomas finished, the room felt smaller somehow. "You're sure about what you saw?" Mercer asked. "I know what I saw," Thomas replied. "That wasn't a deer, that wasn't an animal. That was a person." Mercer leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The Black Hollows, the name hung unspoken between them. For years he had heard the same stories as everyone else. He had dismissed them just like everyone else. Because without evidence, without witnesses, there was nothing he could do. Now he had both, or at least enough to justify a closer look. Still, he hesitated, because going up there meant more than just an investigation. It meant stepping into something no one fully understood, and once you stepped into something like that, there was no guarantee you'd come back out. Mercer stood. "Get some rest," he said. "We move at first light." Thomas nodded, though he knew sleep wouldn't come easily. That night, the town of Red Marsh felt different. Word spread quickly, carried in hushed voices from one house to another. Doors were locked earlier than usual. Windows were checked twice. Lamps burned longer into the night. And somewhere deep in the northern woods, beyond the reach of any lantern light, the Black Hollow family continued whatever it was they had been doing for years, unseen, unchallenged. Until now. Dawn came slowly to Red Marsh, as if the sun itself was reluctant to rise over what lay beyond the northern ridge. A thin mist clung to the ground, weaving through the trees and curling along the dirt paths between houses. The town was quieter than usual. Even the usual morning sounds, chickens, wagon wheels, distant voices, felt muted, as though something unseen had settled over everything. Sheriff Daniel Mercer was already awake. He stood outside the small jailhouse, checking the chamber of his revolver with practiced care. He wasn't a man given to superstition, but he believed in preparation. And whatever waited in Black Hollow, he had no intention of meeting it unready. Behind him, the men he had chosen gathered in uneasy silence. There were 6 in total, not counting Thomas Hale. Jacob Turner and his younger brother Elias, farmers, strong and dependable, both accustomed to hard work and harder conditions. Samuel Pike, a former soldier who had seen more violence than he cared to speak about. Old Nathan Crow, a tracker with a reputation for finding things others couldn't. And 2 others, men who had volunteered, though no one could quite say why. Curiosity, maybe, or pride, or the simple refusal to admit fear. Thomas arrived last. He looked like he hadn't slept, but his eyes were sharp, focused. "You remember the way?" Mercer asked. Thomas nodded. "Every step." Mercer gave a short, approving nod, then he looked at the group. "We go in, we see what's there, and we come back," he said. "No unnecessary risks, no wandering off, we stay together." No one argued, because no one needed to be told what could happen if they didn't. They set out just as the first light broke over the horizon. The trail north was narrow and uneven, winding through thick forest that seemed to close in tighter with every mile. The deeper they went, the less the world felt familiar. The air grew heavier, the trees taller, the silence deeper. At first there were still signs of life, birds calling from distant branches, the occasional rustle of something moving through the undergrowth, but gradually those sounds faded. Until there was nothing left, just the crunch of boots on dirt, and the quiet, oppressive feeling of being watched. No one spoke much. Even the Turner brothers, who were usually quick with conversation, kept their thoughts to themselves. Samuel Pike walked with his rifle ready, his gaze constantly shifting between the trees. Nathan Crow moved differently. He was slower, more deliberate, his eyes scanning the ground as they walked. Every so often he would crouch briefly, studying something invisible to the others, then rise without comment. After nearly 3 hours, Thomas raised a hand. They stopped. "This is it," he said quietly. The clearing lay just ahead. It looked exactly as he remembered. The same patch of open ground, the same towering trees forming a silent wall around it, and in the center, the same unnatural arrangement of rocks. But now, standing there in the daylight, it felt worse. Because it was real, Mercer stepped forward slowly, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Spread out," he said. "Careful where you step." The men moved cautiously, forming a loose circle around the clearing. Nathan was the first to kneel. He brushed aside a thin layer of leaves, exposing the soil beneath. His fingers moved across it lightly, feeling for something. Then he stopped. "Here," he said. Mercer joined him. The earth was loose, recently disturbed. Nathan pressed his hand into it, then lifted it, letting the dirt fall back slowly. "Not more than a few days," he murmured. A silence followed, not the natural kind, something heavier. Jacob Turner was the next to find something. "Over here," he called, his voice tight. They gathered around him. Caught in a low thorn bush was a strip of fabric, blue, torn, stained dark along one edge. Samuel reached out, hesitated, then pulled it free. He turned it in his hands, his expression hardening. "This ain't from work clothes," he said. "Too fine." Mercer took it, studying it carefully. He didn't say what he was thinking. He didn't need to, because everyone else was thinking it too. A few minutes later, Elias Turner found the rope. It was tied around the trunk of a small tree near the edge of the clearing. Frayed, cut, not worn down by time, cut like someone had needed to remove it quickly. Samuel ran a finger along the fibers. "Something fought against this," he said quietly. No one responded because there was nothing to say. They continued searching. Each new discovery added to the same terrible picture. Marks in the dirt where something heavy had been dragged, footprints faint, partially erased, but still visible in places. And then the button. It was small, metal, decorated with a delicate pattern that had no place in the wilderness. Mercer picked it up. For a moment he simply stared at it, then his jaw tightened. "Keep digging," he said. They did, carefully, slowly, but the deeper they went, the less they found. No bodies, no bones. Nothing that could prove beyond doubt what had happened there. Only signs, fragments, enough to suggest the truth, not enough to confirm it. After nearly 2 hours, Mercer stood. "That's enough," he said. The men looked at him, some with relief, others with frustration. "We go to the house," he added. That changed everything. A tension passed through the group like a sudden chill, because this clearing was one thing, but the house, that was something else. "You sure about that?" Samuel asked. Mercer met his gaze. "You saw what's here." Samuel didn't argue. None of them did, because they all knew. If they walked away now, whatever secrets Black Hollow held would stay buried. And more people might disappear. They moved again, this time downhill. The path was harder to follow, steeper, more treacherous. Loose rocks shifted underfoot. Roots twisted across the ground like traps waiting to be sprung. Nathan led the way now, reading the land like a book no one else could understand. It took less than an hour, but it felt longer. Because with every step, the sense of something waiting grew stronger, until finally they saw it. The Black Hollow house, it stood in a small clearing of its own, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to press in from all sides. The structure itself was large but worn, its wood darkened by age and weather, its roof uneven, covered in patches of moss. It leaned slightly, not enough to collapse, but enough to feel wrong. Beside it, a half-ruined barn sagged under its own weight. There were no signs of care, no garden, no animals in sight, just the house, and the silence. A thin line of smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was inside. Mercer stopped. The others gathered behind him. For a moment no one moved, no one spoke. Then Mercer stepped forward. Each footstep felt louder than it should have. The ground seemed to echo beneath them. Halfway to the door it opened, slowly, with a long, creaking sound. A man stood in the doorway, tall, thin, still, Elias Black Hollow. He looked exactly as the stories described. His face was pale, his features sharp, his eyes dark and unblinking. He didn't seem surprised, didn't seem concerned. He simply watched them. Mercer stopped a few feet away. "I'm Sheriff Daniel Mercer," he said. "We need to ask you some questions." Elias said nothing. His gaze moved slowly across the group, taking in each man, each weapon. Then finally he spoke. "The mountains are dangerous," he said, his voice low and rough. "People get lost." Mercer's expression didn't change. "People don't just disappear without a trace." Elias tilted his head slightly. For a moment, something almost like amusement flickered across his face. "Don't they?" he said. The air between them felt colder. He stepped back, opened the door wider. "You may come in," he said. The invitation hung there, heavy, unnatural. Behind Mercer, one of the men shifted uneasily. This was it, the point where they could still turn back. Still walk away. Mercer didn't. He stepped forward, crossed the threshold, and disappeared into the darkness inside. One by one, the others followed. The door closed behind them with a dull, final sound. And just like that, the outside world was gone. The darkness inside the house felt heavier than it should have. Not just dim light or shadow, but something thicker, something that clung to the air and pressed against the senses. Even in the middle of the day, very little sunlight managed to enter. The windows were covered with dark cloth, nailed or tied in place from the inside. Only a few weak candles lit the main room. Their flames flickered unevenly, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The smell hit them almost immediately. It was a mixture of damp wood, old smoke, and something else, something sour, decaying, and unmistakably wrong. Several of the men instinctively covered their noses. Thomas swallowed hard. "You smell that?" he muttered. No one answered, because they all did. The room itself was sparse. A long wooden table stood at the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. The furniture looked old, worn down by years of use without care. The walls were bare except for dark stains and scratches that didn't look accidental. Mercer stepped forward slowly, his eyes scanning everything. Behind him, the others spread out just slightly, careful not to break formation. Elias Black Hollow closed the door. The sound echoed through the house like a final decision. Then movement. From the shadows beyond the main room, figures began to appear. First, a woman. She moved slowly, her posture slightly hunched, her face pale to the point of looking almost unnatural. Her hair was tied loosely, strands falling across her face. Her eyes, they didn't quite focus on anything. Margaret Black Hollow. She didn't speak, she simply stood there watching, or perhaps not watching at all. Then came others. A younger man, thin like Elias but with restless, twitching movements. An older woman, bent and breathing heavily. Two more men, both silent, both carrying the same hollow, distant expression. 6 in total. They formed a loose line behind Elias, watching, waiting. No one in Mercer's group lowered their guard. The air had changed. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was certainty. Something was very wrong here. Mercer cleared his throat, forcing his voice to remain steady. "We're investigating several disappearances," he said. "People last seen passing through this area." Elias didn't respond immediately. He glanced briefly at the others behind him, then back at Mercer. "We don't see many travelers," he said. "We keep to ourselves, that's not what we've heard," Mercer replied. A faint smile appeared on Elias' lips, not friendly, not nervous, just there. "People hear many things," he said. Mercer took a step forward. "We found evidence in the woods, not far from here." That seemed to land, not with panic, not with fear, but with something quieter. A shift. Margaret's fingers twitched slightly at her side. One of the younger men glanced toward the back of the house for just a second, quick enough that most might have missed it, but Mercer didn't. "And we intend to take a look around," Mercer added. This time, Elias didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, then slowly his expression changed. The faint smile faded, his eyes narrowed just slightly. "This is private land," he said. "I'm aware," Mercer replied. "But I have reason to believe a crime has been committed." Another silence, heavier now. The men behind Mercer shifted subtly, hands closer to their weapons. The Black Hollow family did the same, not reaching for guns, but for tools. An axe leaned against the wall near one of the men. A heavy iron poker rested by the hearth. Farm tools, but in that moment they looked like weapons. The room tightened like a storm about to break. Then a sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable, a low, strained moan. Everyone froze. It came from somewhere behind the house, from below. Mercer's head turned slowly toward the source. No one spoke. The sound came again, softer this time, but real, human. Every instinct in Mercer's body snapped into place. He looked back at Elias. "What is that?" he asked. Elias said nothing, but something had changed. The calm was gone, replaced by something darker. "Open the rest of this house," Mercer said, his voice sharper now. "No," Elias replied, simple, final, that was enough. Mercer drew his revolver. The sound of it echoed like a crack through the silence. Behind him, the others did the same. Metal clicked, hammers pulled back, the balance shifted instantly. The Black Hollow family tensed, but they didn't move, not yet. Mercer took a step toward the back of the house. Elias moved to block him. For the first time, there was real emotion in his face. Not fear, not guilt, something closer to warning. "You don't understand," Elias said. "Move," Mercer replied. The two men stood there just feet apart, one representing the law. The other something older, something twisted. Then Elias spoke again, quiet, low. "You should leave," he said, "while you still can." Mercer didn't hesitate. "Last chance," he said. A long moment passed, then Elias stepped aside. But as he did, he leaned slightly closer to Mercer and whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "Some things don't come back once they're found." Mercer ignored him. He moved past, toward the back of the house. The others followed, weapons still raised. The air grew colder as they moved deeper inside. The smell worsened. The sound came again, clearer now, a weak, broken attempt at a voice. They reached a door. It was heavy, wooden, reinforced. 3 locks on the outside, 3. No one spoke because no one needed to. This wasn't storage. This wasn't normal. This was something else entirely. Mercer reached out and touched the door. It was cold. He turned back to the others briefly. Every face told the same story. They knew, whatever was behind this door, it would change everything. Mercer began removing the locks, one by one. Each one creaked loudly as it came free. The sound filled the house. Behind them, the Black Hollow family stood silent, watching, waiting. The final lock fell away. Mercer wrapped his hand around the handle. For a moment, just a moment, he hesitated. Then he pulled. The door opened. And the smell that came out was enough to make 2 men stagger back immediately. It was overwhelming, rot, waste, decay, and something far worse. Darkness stretched downward. A set of wooden steps leading into blackness. Mercer grabbed a candle from nearby and held it forward. The flame trembled. He stepped onto the first stair. It creaked under his weight. Behind him, Thomas followed. Then Samuel. The others stayed above, watching the family. Mercer descended slowly. Each step deeper felt heavier. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. The light revealed shapes, at first unclear, then chains fixed into the walls, heavy. Iron, not for animals, for people. Mercer's grip tightened on the candle. They stepped off the final stair. The room below was larger than expected, and worse, far worse. The ground was stained, dark patches everywhere. Clothes lay scattered, shoes, bags, personal belongings, too many. Far too many, then movement in the far corner. Mercer turned, raised the candle, and saw her. A woman chained to the wall, barely alive. Her body was thin, too thin, her skin pale and marked with bruises and scars. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face. When the light hit her eyes, she flinched, like an animal afraid of being struck. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because what they were seeing, it wasn't just a crime. It was something else, something prolonged, something deliberate. Mercer stepped closer, slowly. "It's all right," he said quietly. "We're here to help." She didn't respond with words, only a weak sound, a broken attempt at something human. Thomas swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "How long?" No one answered, because no one wanted to imagine it. Behind them, a crash echoed from above, shouting, struggle. The family was fighting. Mercer didn't look back. "Get her free," he said. Samuel moved immediately, grabbing a rusted tool nearby and bringing it down hard against the chain. Metal rang out, again, again. The chain weakened. Finally, it snapped. The woman collapsed forward. Mercer caught her before she hit the ground. She weighed almost nothing, like holding bones wrapped in skin. Above them, the noise grew louder, furniture breaking, men shouting, the sound of a fight spilling out of control. Mercer turned toward the stairs. "We're done here," he said. They lifted her carefully and began climbing back up, into whatever chaos was waiting above, because one thing was now certain. The truth of Black Hollow was far worse than anyone had feared. By the time Mercer and the others emerged from the cellar, the house above had erupted into chaos. Furniture lay overturned. One of the chairs had been smashed against the wall. Jacob Turner had Elias Black Hollow pinned to the ground, his arm twisted behind his back as the man struggled with unnatural strength. Samuel Pike stood with his rifle aimed at 2 of the younger men, forcing them to their knees. Margaret stood near the far wall, rocking slightly, muttering under her breath in a low, broken whisper that didn't sound entirely like English. Nathan Crow had one of the older women restrained, though she barely resisted, her body trembling, her breathing shallow and uneven. The moment Mercer stepped fully into the room with the woman in his arms, everything shifted. Silence fell, not complete, but enough. Every eye in the room turned toward her, and for the first time something like recognition passed across the faces of the Black Hollow family. Not guilt, not remorse, but something colder. Like the quiet acknowledgement of something inevitable. Mercer lowered her carefully onto the floor, shrugging off his coat and placing it over her fragile body. She shivered violently, her limbs twitching as if unsure how to exist outside the darkness she had been kept in for so long. Thomas knelt beside her, his face pale. "Easy, you're safe now," he said, though his voice carried more hope than certainty. She didn't understand, or maybe she did, but didn't believe it. Her eyes darted around the room, wide and unfocused, landing briefly on each man before flinching away again. When Samuel stepped closer with a canteen, she recoiled sharply, pressing herself against the floor as far as the weak strength in her body allowed. Mercer stood again, turning slowly toward Elias. "Bind them," he said. No one hesitated. Ropes were pulled tight, wrists secured. Every member of the Black Hollow family was restrained, their movements limited, their silence unsettling. And then Elias laughed. It was quiet at first, a dry, hollow sound that didn't belong in a human throat. Jacob tightened his grip. "Shut up," he snapped, but Elias didn't stop. He turned his head slightly, looking at Mercer with those same still, unblinking eyes. "You think this ends it?" he said. Mercer didn't respond. Elias' lips curled faintly. "You think you've found everything?" The room held its breath. "Start talking," Mercer said. Elias tilted his head as if considering. Then he spoke calmly, casually, like a man explaining a simple routine. "They came to us," he said, "one by one, lost, tired, alone." No one interrupted. "Some we helped," he continued. "At first," Thomas clenched his jaw, "but most," Elias went on, "most were easier than that." The words settled heavily into the room. "You took them," Mercer said. Elias didn't deny it. "We used what we were given," he replied. "Given," Samuel snapped. "You call that given?" Elias ignored him. "The mountains don't provide for those who can't take what they need," he said. "We learned that long ago." Mercer stepped closer. "You kept them alive down there, for as long as they were useful." The words landed like a blow. Thomas looked down at the woman, then back at Elias. "How many?" he demanded. For the first time, Elias hesitated, but only for a second. "Enough," he said. The answer was worse than any number. Mercer felt something cold settle in his chest. "You killed them," he said. Elias' expression didn't change. "They didn't all last," he said. That was as close to an admission as he was going to get. Behind him, Margaret's whispering grew louder. Fragments of words slipped through, old phrases, half-formed prayers, something that sounded like it had been carried across generations and broken along the way. Samuel shifted uneasily. "We need to get out of here," he muttered. Mercer nodded. He had heard enough. "Move them," he ordered. "All of them back to town." No one argued, because there was nothing left to question, only what came next. Getting them out of the house was harder than it should have been. Not because the family resisted, they didn't, not anymore, but because of the weight of what had been uncovered. Every step outside felt like stepping out of something that shouldn't exist. The air was different, cleaner, but it didn't feel like relief, not yet. They secured the prisoners with extra rope, binding them tightly before beginning the long descent back toward Redmarsh. The rescued woman couldn't walk, not properly. Her legs trembled too violently, her strength too far gone, so they carried her, taking turns, carefully, as if she might break, because she might. The journey back was slower, heavier. No one spoke much. There was nothing left to say. Behind them, the Black Hollow house stood silent once more, empty now, but not forgotten. It took hours before they reached the edge of town. By then, the sun had begun to fall, and word had already spread. People were waiting. Dozens at first, then more. By the time the group emerged fully into Redmarsh, it felt like the entire town had gathered. They stood in silence, watching, as the prisoners were brought in. As the truth long whispered, long avoided, finally took shape in front of them, some faces showed anger, others grief, some simply looked away, because seeing it made it real. Mercer didn't stop. He led the group straight to the jail. The prisoners were locked away immediately, each in a separate cell, guarded constantly. There would be no chance of escape, not now, not after everything. The woman was taken elsewhere, to the home of the town's doctor. She needed more than safety. She needed care, real care, something she hadn't known in a long time. That night Redmarsh didn't sleep. Lights burned in windows long past midnight. Voices carried through the streets in hushed, urgent tones. Stories surfaced, old ones. Forgotten ones. People remembered things they hadn't thought about in years. Someone who never returned, a journey that ended without explanation, a face that slowly faded from memory. Now they knew, or at least they understood enough. Mercer sat alone in his office. The evidence lay spread across the desk in front of him. Clothing, personal items, things that had once belonged to people who had names, lives, families. He picked up a small object, a pocket watch, worn but intact. It still ticked. He stared at it for a long moment, then set it down. Outside, the town remained awake. Inside the jail, the Black Hollow family sat in silence. And somewhere across town, a woman who had been lost to the darkness for years lay in a bed, breathing slowly, her body finally beginning to understand that it was no longer trapped. But the truth of what had happened, that would take much longer to face, because this wasn't just the end of something, it was the beginning of everything that came after, and not all of it would be easy to bear. The days that followed felt unreal, as if Red Marsh had been pulled out of its ordinary life and placed into something heavier, something it didn't know how to carry. Word spread fast, faster than anyone expected. By the second day, people from neighboring towns had already begun arriving, some out of curiosity, others because they feared the same thing might have been happening closer to their own homes. By the end of the week, even distant cities had heard whispers of what had been uncovered in the mountains. A family, living in isolation, taking people, keeping them, using them for years. No one wanted to believe it fully. But the evidence left no room for doubt. Sheriff Mercer barely slept. His office had become a place of constant movement, reports being written, statements taken, items catalogued one by one. Every object recovered from the house and cellar was laid out carefully, each one treated not as an object but as a piece of someone's life. And every time someone came to look, there was a moment of hope, followed more often than not by grief. An older man recognized a leather satchel his brother had carried years ago. A woman identified a ring she had last seen on her daughter's hand before she left for a journey she never completed. Each confirmation closed one question and opened something far heavier. Mercer stood through most of it, listening, watching, carrying it all in silence because someone had to. The woman they had rescued remained under the care of Dr. Harlan Webb and his wife. At first she barely moved, barely spoke. Even simple things seemed foreign to her: light, space, the presence of other people. She startled easily, flinching at sudden movements, shrinking away from any attempt at contact. But she was alive, and that mattered. Days passed before she spoke a full word, weeks before she spoke a full sentence. And even then it came slowly, broken, like something that had to be relearned from the beginning. Mercer visited only once during those early days. He stood at the doorway, not wanting to push her, not wanting to become another figure she feared. When she looked at him, there was confusion in her eyes, not recognition, not yet, but something softer than before. He didn't ask her anything. He simply nodded once and left, because some answers could wait, others would come in time. Back at the jail, the Black Hollow family remained exactly as they had been brought in. Silent, separated, watched constantly. Mercer questioned them one by one. The results were uneven. The younger ones spoke little, some claiming they had only followed orders, others refusing to say anything at all. Margaret drifted between awareness and something else entirely, her words tangled, her thoughts fragmented. But Elias spoke, not with hesitation, not with fear, but with the same unsettling calm he had shown from the beginning. He explained things the way a man might explain how to tend crops or repair a fence. Routine, necessary. Unquestioned, they watched the trails, they waited, they chose carefully. Those who traveled alone were easiest. Couples sometimes required more effort. Once taken, they were brought to the house. Then to the cellar. There they stayed for as long as they could. For as long as they were useful, Elias said. Mercer forced himself to listen, to write it down, because no matter how sickening it was, it had to be recorded. Why? Mercer asked at one point. Elias looked at him almost as if the question didn't make sense. Because we needed to, he said. That was all, no apology, no explanation beyond that, just a simple statement of belief. The trials began as soon as they could be arranged. The courthouse in Red Marsh had never seen anything like it. People filled every available space, standing shoulder to shoulder, some having traveled miles just to witness what would happen. The air inside was thick, not just with heat, but with expectation, with anger, with the weight of everything that had come to light. Elias was tried first. The evidence spoke for itself. The items recovered, the testimony of those who had lost someone. And finally, the testimony of the woman who had survived. She stood in that courtroom, still thin, still fragile, but stronger than she had been. Her voice trembled, but she spoke. She described the moment she had been taken, the false kindness, the sudden violence, the darkness that followed. She did not describe everything. She didn't need to. What she did say was enough. The room fell silent when she finished. Even those who had come only out of curiosity understood then. This wasn't a story, this was real. The defense tried. They spoke of isolation, of a life removed from society, of a different way of understanding right and wrong, but their words fell flat because no one there could accept that. Not after hearing what had been done. The verdict came quickly, guilty on all counts. The sentence followed, death. Elias received it without reaction, no anger, no fear, no regret. He simply stood there, as if it didn't matter. The others were judged in turn. Some received long prison sentences. Margaret was declared unfit to stand trial, her mind too far gone to answer for what she had been part of. She was taken away, not to freedom, but to a different kind of confinement. The day of the execution came quietly. No public gathering, no spectacle, just a few witnesses. Mercer was among them, not because he wanted to be, but because he felt he had to see it through. From beginning to end, Elias walked to the gallows without resistance. The same calm, the same stillness. When asked for final words, he said nothing. The trap fell, and just like that it was over, or at least the part people could see. The rest that lingered, the house in Black Hollow, did not stand much longer. A few months later, a group of men returned to the site. They brought tools and fire. The structure burned slowly, the flames rising into the sky, visible even from the edge of Red Marsh. When it collapsed, it took something with it, not everything, but something. The cellar was filled in, sealed, buried beneath earth and stone, left there, where it could no longer be entered, but never truly erased. Time moved forward as it always does. The town returned to something like normal. Shops reopened, fields were tended, voices filled the streets again. But something had changed, something permanent. People watched more closely, asked more questions, paid more attention when someone didn't return when they were supposed to, because now they knew what could happen when no one looked. The woman who had been rescued slowly rebuilt her life. It wasn't easy, it never would be. But she learned to speak again, to walk without fear, to exist outside of the darkness that had defined her for so long. She never spoke much about what she had endured, not publicly, but those close to her understood. Some things don't need to be said to be felt. Mercer remained sheriff. He carried the case with him long after it was over. The names, the faces, the items left behind, he kept many of them, not out of duty, but because he couldn't bring himself to let them be forgotten. Years later, people still spoke of Black Hollow, not loudly, not often, but enough. Enough that the story didn't fade completely, enough that the memory remained, a warning. A reminder that even in the most beautiful places there can be darkness, hidden, patient, waiting, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the evil itself, but how long it's allowed to exist before someone finally chooses to face it.